November 17th, 1973. Joan Kennedy is at a hospital in the Boston area, waiting for surgeons to amputate her 12-year-old son's right leg above the knee. Ted Kennedy Jr., Teddy, the middle child, had first noticed a swelling in his right leg. His parents brought him to a doctor. An X-ray was taken. The doctors recognized it immediately. Chemotherapy was attempted. It failed. Amputation was what remained. The diagnosis was osteosarcoma, bone cancer in his right leg. The survival rate for osteosarcoma in 1973 was roughly 10 to 15%. On November 17th, surgeons removed his right leg above the knee. He was 12 years old. He would go on to spend a year and a half receiving high-dose experimental chemotherapy as part of a clinical trial for methotrexate, at doses whose safe limits had not yet been established, because the effective dose wasn't yet known. He lost all his hair. He couldn't eat. Every 3 weeks, just as he started to feel better, he went back in. That day at the hospital, while Joan waited for the operation to end, Ted Kennedy attended his niece Kathleen's wedding, then returned to the hospital. That sequence, wedding, then hospital, isn't the story most people know when they think about Joan Kennedy. The story most people know is that she was an alcoholic, a liability, a fragile woman who wasn't tough enough for the Kennedys. The story that gets told about Joan Kennedy has always been about her weakness. This story is about something else. It's about what was done to her and who was allowed to do it, and how the same behavior that destroyed her public reputation protected the man who shared it. Joan Kennedy was never unstable. She was in the process of being broken by a sustained sequence of events that would have broken almost anyone, and the breaking was called her fault. Virginia Joan Bennett was born on September 2, 1936, in New York City, and raised in Bronxville, New York. Her father, Harry Wiggin Bennett Jr., was president of a New York advertising agency and a Cornell graduate. The family was Catholic, well-off, and by every account, thoroughly conventional. She attended Manhattanville College in Purchase, New York, which Jean Kennedy had also attended. In October 1957, at a gymnasium dedication on campus, the gym was being named for Jean's sister Kathleen, who had died in a plane crash in France 9 years earlier. Jean introduced Joan to her younger brother, Ted. He was finishing his law degree at the University of Virginia. He was 25. She was 21. Joan grew nervous about marrying someone she barely knew. Ted's father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., overruled her hesitation and pushed the engagement forward. They married at St. Joseph's Church in Bronxville on November 29, 1958, officiated by Cardinal Francis Spellman, just weeks after Ted's brother John won re-election to the United States Senate. She entered the most famous family in American politics, carrying no particular preparation for what it required. The Kennedy women, Ethel, Jackie, Rose, were competitive, politically fluent, armored in their different ways. Joan was, in Adam Clymer's direct assessment in his biography of Ted Kennedy, shy and a really reserved person, and the Kennedys aren't. Gary Wills, in The Kennedy Imprisonment, identified the structural problem immediately. Joan Bennett Kennedy suffered a double disadvantage at the family table. She isn't only not a Kennedy. By birth and by temperament, she was already being judged against standards she hadn't consented to and couldn't meet. 3 children arrived: Cara in 1960, Edward Jr. in 1961, Patrick in 1967. From the outside, it looked like precisely the marriage a Kennedy senator required. From the inside, almost from the beginning, it was something else. Ted Kennedy's extramarital relationships began early in the marriage and didn't stop. By the early 1970s, biographers describe his affairs as spinning out of control. The names that became part of the public record over the years included Amanda Burden, a New York socialite, Susie Chaffee, the Olympic skier, and Stephanie Pinole, described as a Senate intern. A 1990 Gentleman's Quarterly expose broke into public view with documented accounts of his drinking and womanizing with girls in their 20s, including an allegation that he had been found with a female lobbyist on the floor of a private dining room at a Capitol Hill restaurant. That GQ expose ran in 1990. Joan's first drunk driving arrest had been in 1974. For 16 years, his behavior was protected, while hers was recorded. According to Marcia Chellis, who worked as Joan's personal secretary and aide from 1979 to 1982 and published a book about the experience in 1985, Joan sought out Joan Kennedy Onassis for guidance after learning that her husband was having an affair with Amanda Burden. Jackie's response, as Chellis recounted it, was that Kennedy men were like that. It didn't mean anything, and Joan shouldn't take it personally. Joan couldn't accept that framing. She wasn't built for it. Chellis documented that her employer couldn't shake off the hurt of her husband's infidelity. The advice Jackie offered, treat it as nothing, absorb the humiliation, keep performing the marriage, was the emotional survival strategy of a woman who had practiced it. Joan hadn't. Nobody had offered her a manual, and she was fundamentally unsuited for the performance it required. She had already suffered 2 miscarriages before 1969. The first and second losses arrived while Ted's infidelities were beginning and accelerating. There was grief in the marriage, without anyone naming it as grief. The children she had carried and lost were mourned privately, in a household where strength was the only acceptable posture and vulnerability was regarded as a bad fit. On July 18, 1969, Ted Kennedy drove off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island in Massachusetts. Mary Jo Kopechne, 28 years old, a campaign worker for Robert Kennedy's 1968 presidential run, died in the submerged vehicle. Ted Kennedy swam to safety. He waited approximately 9 to 10 hours before reporting the accident to police. He pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident at Edgartown District Court before Judge James A. Boyle and received a 2-month suspended sentence, no jail time, and 1 year of probation. He had also been fined $75 for speeding in connection with the incident. Joan was pregnant at the time of the accident. She had been placed on bed rest after her previous miscarriages. She attended Kopechne's funeral anyway, and stood beside Ted in court when he entered his plea. How Joan learned about the accident is a fact almost no account of this story includes. Chellis later documented what Joan told her. She found out, not from Ted, but by overhearing a phone call. Ted called his girlfriend Helga before he or anyone else told me what was going on, Chellis quoted Joan as saying. I couldn't talk to anyone about it. I had to stay upstairs. The house was full of lawyers and political aides. Joan, pregnant and on bed rest, wasn't permitted to come downstairs. In 1974, on a People magazine cover, Joan spoke publicly about Chappaquiddick for the first time. She called it a tragic accident, very unfortunate. She said she believed everything Ted had told her. She defended him completely and on the record. She was still doing what had always been required of her: managing the appearance, protecting the narrative, staying upstairs. Approximately 1 month after Kopechne's funeral, Joan miscarried for the 3rd time. That is the sequence. She was pregnant, she was on bed rest. She attended the funeral of a young woman who died in her husband's car. She stood beside him in court while he pleaded guilty. She overheard him calling his girlfriend before calling her. She miscarried a month later. Multiple confirmed sources are direct. Her drinking worsened sharply after Chappaquiddick. The cause and effect chain requires no speculation. The next 4 years layered grief onto grief. Ted's affairs continued. His political career improbably survived. Joan's drinking escalated in proportion to each new accumulation of loss and humiliation, which is to say, it escalated steadily, with no interruption. And then, in late 1973, their son's leg was diagnosed as cancerous. Ted Kennedy Jr. described the initial diagnosis in a 2013 interview, speaking at the 40th anniversary of the date he lost his leg. "I was 12 years old when I was diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer and had my right leg amputated above the knee. Chemotherapy was attempted. It failed. The amputation followed on November 17, 1973. The speed of the final decision, from the failure of treatment to surgery, was its own particular violence. The chemotherapy that followed was experimental by any measure. Ted Jr. was enrolled in an early trial for high-dose methotrexate. The dosing wasn't yet established. They were administering concentrations far beyond what would later be determined safe, because the correct threshold was still unknown. He lost his hair. He had mouth sores and couldn't eat. He lost substantial weight. He went back to the hospital every 3 weeks throughout 7th and 8th grade, his body being treated with a drug whose correct dosage nobody yet knew. The odds of surviving osteosarcoma in 1973, roughly 1 in 7 or 8, meant every round of treatment was being done with the knowledge that it probably wouldn't be enough. Joan was present for all of it. She waded through the amputation. She was photographed walking with Ted Jr. as he learned to navigate on crutches. The Boston Globe, in a 2000 interview, captured the weight of what that period meant to her. Through decades that delivered her 3 miscarriages, the loss of her eldest son's leg to cancer, and a grinding post-divorce loneliness, her drinking worsened. The article written about Joan's life at that point counted her tragedies in the same breath as her alcoholism. That is the right way to count them. They weren't separate phenomena. They were the same story, told from different angles. By 1974, Joan's first drunk driving arrest was on the public record. It was documented, reported, and attached to her name. Her alcoholism would become, in Time magazine's description, her defining characteristic, her well-chronicled problem. The phrase a journalist could reach for when characterizing her in a single word. During the same period, according to the Harvard Shorenstein Center study by Neil Gabler on media coverage of Edward Kennedy, through virtually the entire duration of Joan's marriage, no respectable broadcast network, no acceptable magazine had ever given documentation either about Kennedy's drinking or about his womanizing. Not once. His alcohol use during the same years was treated as a private matter. His affairs were treated as a private matter. Joan's DUI was in the newspaper. The asymmetry wasn't incidental. It was systematic. The institutional press of that era extended to Ted Kennedy a protection it had no interest in extending to his wife. Lawrence Leamer, author of The Kennedy Women, documented what the asymmetry looked like inside the family itself. At the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, other family members used to point at her and say, "She's a drunk," Leamer told the Associated Press, while they're lying there with a drink in their hands. That image captures the structure of the double standard more precisely than any argument about it could. The members of the family who mocked Joan for her alcoholism were members of a family with documented, extensive histories of alcohol and substance use. The difference wasn't the behavior. The difference was who was allowed to keep it private and who wasn't. Joan wasn't allowed. She was the outsider. She was not a Kennedy. Her failures were public record. Theirs were private matters. Time magazine ran a profile of Joan Kennedy in 1979, headlined, "The Vulnerable Soul of Jonesy." The title is instructive, affectionate in its way, but simultaneously infantilizing and pathologizing. She was Jonesy. She was vulnerable. She was a soul, and souls are fragile, and fragile things break. The Deseret News, in a 2005 piece on her ongoing struggles with alcohol, ran the subhead, "Her Innocence and Shyness Blamed for Bad Fit with Family." Blamed. Her personality, her introversion, her refusal to perform the exuberance she wasn't built for, was the explanation. The failure was located in Joan, not in Ted's infidelities, not in Ted's Chappaquiddick, not in Ted's drinking, which the press had protected for decades. By 1977, Joan had attended her first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. In 1978, still legally married to Ted, separated but not yet divorced, she gave an interview to People magazine that ran as a cover story. She was among the first prominent women in America to speak publicly about her alcoholism, at a time when women weren't supposed to have it, weren't supposed to name it, and certainly weren't supposed to put it on the cover of a national magazine. She spoke plainly. "I didn't know why I was drinking too much," she told People. "At times, I drank to feel less inhibited, to relax at parties. Other times, I drank to block out unhappiness, to drown my sorrows." She said that, on the record, in public, without euphemism. The cultural infrastructure for that kind of honesty barely existed in 1978. Women with alcoholism were understood, in the dominant narrative of that decade, as moral failures, or as wives who had failed to hold their families together. Joan Kennedy stepped in front of that narrative and named her own experience in her own words. The fact that she relapsed shortly after publication, described in accounts of the period as overwhelmed by the public exposure, does not diminish what she did by saying it. It makes the whole picture more true. She also said something in that 1978 period that reporters mostly overlooked in their focus on her diagnosis, that her growing self-confidence meant she no longer felt trapped in any role she didn't want. That it had been hard for Ted at first because she used to defer to him on everything, and now she could say no. That she was part of the decisions now, and she didn't feel resentful. She was describing the beginning of a self she hadn't been permitted to have for 20 years of marriage. That shift, from agreeing to everything to being able to say no, is the narrative of her recovery more honestly than any clinical account of sobriety would be. The thing she was recovering from wasn't just alcoholism. It was the entire architecture of self-erasure the marriage had required. Ted and Joan had separated in 1978. The divorce was finalized in 1982, with legal proceedings extending through 1983. But they remained legally married through his 1980 presidential campaign, and Joan appeared throughout it, at his announcement in Boston's historic Faneuil Hall, at events and fundraisers, in public with her husband, performing the unified marriage that the campaign required. Thomas Oliphant, the Boston Globe reporter who traveled with the Kennedy campaign, later described Joan to the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. Her health was quite good at that point. She, more than the senator, came back to chat with the press in the campaign plane. A lot of us would see her coming and be very careful to hide the drink or whatever. She was very personable, very warm, very conversationally at ease. And then Oliphant added this. In light of everything that's happened since then, it's hard to get this across, but she really was in good shape then. If you wanted to get Freudian about it, it's pretty easy to figure out why. Because he needed her. He needed her. When Ted Kennedy needed Joan Kennedy, she was included, treated with warmth, protected by proximity to his power. When the campaign ended and he didn't need her anymore, the marriage ended too. The currency of her inclusion had always been his political usefulness for her, not her own standing. Marcia Chellis documented that Joan was portraying herself as sober when she wasn't, during the campaign period. She was performing recovery for a man whose political needs required a stable-looking wife, while the central cause of her instability sat at the top of the ticket. The academic study of the 1980 campaign in Presidential Studies Quarterly described Joan as deployed in a public performance tailored to the role of the politician's perfect wife, sitting with her hands folded in her lap, smiling and controlled. Managed, coached, presented. What that same period of her life also contained, and what receives almost no coverage alongside the coaching and the management, in 1980, Joan Kennedy testified before the United States Congress on mental health issues. Her testimony helped pass the Mental Health Systems Act of 1980. The woman described in the press as fragile and unstable, as a liability to be managed, walked into the Congress of the United States and contributed to federal law. That fact sits alongside her DUI arrests in the historical record. It just doesn't get cited as often. Now for the arithmetic of the double standard, because the research produced the most revealing document imaginable, Ted Kennedy's own accounting of it. In 2009, Kennedy died of brain cancer at 77. His posthumous memoir, True Compass, was published that fall. In it, he insisted he had never been an alcoholic. He insisted his drinking had never interfered with his Senate work. And then, as evidence of his relative moderation, he invoked his ex-wife. His drinking, he wrote, had never gotten as bad as the well-chronicled alcoholism of ex-wife Joan. He used her public record as his own defense. The spectacle the press had made of Joan Kennedy's struggles, the arrests, the hospitalizations, the guardianship, the sidewalk, became the standard against which Ted measured his own drinking and found himself adequate. She had no such measuring stick. The press had protected him for decades, so there was no comparable record to point at. There was only Joan's documented pain, which he cited in a memoir to distinguish himself from it. That sentence from True Compass isn't a small thing. It's a man using the suffering of a woman he spent 25 years damaging as a character reference for himself. In 1998, 11 years before that memoir, CBS journalist Leslie Stahl had asked Ted Kennedy directly about his drinking on camera. His response? "I went through a lot of difficult times over a period of my life where that may have been somewhat of a factor or force. I never felt that myself. Others did, and I don't question their own kind of assessment of it. But, as I say, that's really in the past." He never felt it was a problem. Others had their assessments, and he didn't argue with their assessments. But he had his own. That's really in the past. Joan never got that interview. Joan's version of "that's really in the past" was a court-ordered guardian over her $9 million estate, which her children obtained in 2004 because her alcoholism had never stopped. Her past was always present, always documented, always on the public record. 6 years after that Stahl interview, Patrick Kennedy published A Common Struggle, a memoir that described his father Ted as suffering from disabling alcoholism and using alcohol to self-medicate through decades of grief over his brother's deaths. Patrick wrote that his father had been passing his unprocessed trauma on to his children. On 60 Minutes, when asked to confirm that Ted Kennedy had been an alcoholic, Patrick declined to say so explicitly on television, even though the book's characterization was already in print. That collision of accounts, the 1998 deflection, the 2009 memoir's self-exculpation via Joan, the 2015 Sun's written characterization of disabling addiction, is the double standard in 3 acts. Ted got to define his own narrative. Joan's narrative was defined for her by the press, by the family, by her ex-husband's memoir. The years after the divorce weren't the clean recovery arc the story seems to want. Joan earned a master's in education from Lesley University in 1982. She performed classical music with orchestras. She worked with children's charities. She said in the 1978 interview that preceded the divorce that she had found confidence through school, piano, living alone. And those words were true of something real, a version of herself she had been looking for and was beginning to find. But the alcoholism followed her out of the marriage. DUI arrests in 1991 and 2000. After the third arrest in 1991, a court ordered her into treatment. After the fourth in 2000 on Cape Cod, she received 2 years of probation and another round of treatment. In 2004, her son Ted Jr. obtained court-ordered legal guardianship of her affairs. In March 2005, a passerby found her unconscious on a Boston sidewalk near her home. She was hospitalized with a concussion and a broken shoulder. That same year, 2005, she was diagnosed with breast cancer and underwent surgery. Marcia Chellis herself, who was a recovering alcoholic and who had lived inside Joan's household for 3 years, wrote in her 1985 book that someone else can't give one alcoholism. The disease was Joan's own. But Chellis also documented how the stress of striving to be an acceptable Kennedy wife could contribute to one's drinking. The disease and the conditions that fed it aren't the same thing. The one was biological and followed her through her life. The other was created by choices a different person made, and then protected by institutions that decided his choices were private, and hers weren't. There is a through line from the 1960s to the Boston sidewalk in 2005, and it runs through Chappaquiddick, through a third miscarriage, through a 12-year-old's amputation, through a presidential campaign that used her as a prop and put her back when it was over. The disease accelerated in response to specific, documented events. That is the cause and effect chain the research supports. It doesn't simplify her suffering into something clean. It just assigns it accurately. Joan Kennedy died on October 8, 2025. She was 89 years old. She died peacefully in her sleep at her home in Boston. Her death certificate listed dementia as the cause of death. Her alcoholism was described as in remission. Ted Kennedy had died 16 years earlier, in August 2009. She outlived him. That is a fact, and it isn't a small one. Ted Kennedy Jr. released a statement after her death that began, "I will always admire my mother for the way that she faced up to her challenges with grace, courage, humility, and honesty. She taught me how to be more truthful with myself and how careful listening is a more powerful communication skill than public speaking." The 12-year-old who had lost his leg in 1973, who his mother had waited beside in a hospital while his father attended a wedding, who had gone on to become a disability rights advocate and a Connecticut state legislator. That son was describing his mother as a teacher of honesty, as a model for how to face hard things and say true things about them. Patrick Kennedy said she had been a power of example to millions of people with mental health conditions. Her daughter-in-law, Maria Shriver, wrote, "She courageously shared what it was like to lose a child, get divorced from a famous man, and carry on. Her life was challenging, but she persevered. As a young girl, I marveled at her grace, her beauty, her elegance. As a woman, I respected her grit, her resilience, her perseverance." The obituaries described her as a quiet pioneer in publicly addressing challenges with alcoholism and depression, at a time when few others would. That phrase, quiet pioneer, is accurate and important. In 1978, standing in front of a People magazine interviewer and saying on the cover that she drank to block out unhappiness, to drown her sorrows, that was an act of public courage that cost her something. It required naming what had been private, in a culture that didn't yet have language for what she was naming. Ted Kennedy never did anything comparable. He deflected, minimized, and then invoked her documented suffering as his own alibi. His son called his alcoholism disabling in print. His children staged an intervention over his drinking in 1991 that failed. Through all of it, he never walked into a room of cameras and said, "I did this. It cost people I loved. Here is what it looked like from the inside." Joan Kennedy did that in 1978. She was 42 years old, legally married to a man who had just announced a presidential campaign, separated from him, living in a Boston apartment, enrolled in a master's program, and she told the truth about herself to a national magazine. The word the press reached for when they described her, vulnerable, fragile, unstable, was doing specific ideological work. It located the problem in her character. It protected the marriage, the campaign, the dynasty. It kept Ted's identical behavior out of the frame. The label held for decades, long enough to become the received version of her story. It wasn't the true one. The true version is that Joan Kennedy sat in a hospital in November 1973 with a son whose survival odds were roughly 1 in 7, having already grieved 3 miscarriages, having already stood beside her husband in court while he pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident that killed a 28-year-old woman, having already learned about Chappaquiddick by overhearing her husband call his girlfriend before calling her. She sat there, and she kept going. She testified to Congress. She told the truth in public. She outlived the marriage, outlived the ex-husband, outlived the century that had tried to define her. She was never unstable. She was carrying more than anyone should be asked to carry, without adequate support, in a family that mocked her for her struggles while engaging in the same ones. The asymmetry in how her suffering was treated, public, shameful, defining, and how his was treated, private, excused, erased, isn't a retrospective feminist interpretation. It's documented. It's in the archives of the Harvard Shorenstein Center and the pages of Ted Kennedy's own memoir. 89 years old, died in her sleep, at home in Boston, with her alcoholism listed as in remission. That isn't a cautionary tale. That is a woman who survived the Kennedys. Subscribe for more stories like this.